The Dreams of Ghosts and Indians, a novel by Preston Jacobs, available in paperback and ebook. So, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms premieres this year, so let's get everyone up to speed on what A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is and the material it's based on. We're going to go through all the stories, so when the show premieres, you will be a psychotic expert. So in case you didn't know, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is the third and latest series set in the Game of Thrones universe, set about 90 years before the original Game of Thrones and 80 years after House of the Dragon. And it's based on 3 existing short stories, novellas, whatever you want to call them, by George R. Martin, that follow the adventures of Dunk and Egg. Dunk being a man claiming to be a hedge knight, and Egg being his squire with a big secret. And while fans refer to these tales as the Dunk and Egg stories or the Tales of Dunk and Egg, marketers poo-pooed this as Dunk and Egg sound like a sitcom. And so when the Dunk and Egg stories were released as a collection, it was called A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, and so the show is too. Which is ironic as Dunk is not a knight. Whatever the case, there are currently 3 and only 3 Dunk and Egg stories. There's the Hedge Knight, the Sworn Sword, and the Mystery Knight. The Hedge Knight was written in 1997, published in 1998 in the Legends anthology. The Sworn Sword was written in 2002, published in 2003 in the Legends 2 anthology. And the Mystery Knight was written in 2008 and published in 2010 in the Warriors anthology. And this is somewhat relevant as the Hedge Knight was written around the time of A Clash of Kings, the Sworn Sword was written around the time of A Feast for Crows, and the Mystery Knight was written around the time of A Dance with Dragons. And you can find various ideas introduced in the Tales of Dunk and Egg cross-pollinated into A Song of Ice and Fire, and vice versa. For example, Maester Aemon's backstory is expanded upon at the beginning of A Clash of Kings, despite the character barely being in the book. And this is likely because his family appears in The Hedge Knight, which was written around the same time. Or you may have noticed that an unusually large amount of time is given to the Brackens and the Blackwoods in the Jaime story in A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. And this is likely because these chapters were written shortly after The Sworn Sword. Anyway, the first season of the show will be following the Hedge Knight, the second season of the show will be following the Sworn Sword, and while it's not confirmed, it's presumed that the third season will be following the Mystery Knight. As for other stories, well, we're told that the characters go to Dorne in between the first and second stories. There's nothing written, but fans refer to the possibility of this tale as the Dornish Adventure. And while George R. Martin has mused in the past about writing this, he hasn't really given any indication that this story is at all a priority. He has said that the second season of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms will be based on the Sworn Sword, so it looks like no Dornish adventure. Now, George has said several times that he has a fairly fleshed out idea of a story happening after the Mystery Knight that occurs at Winterfell. And this story is known as the She-Wolves of Winterfell. And George knows enough about the story that he put a fairly detailed family tree with many of the characters in the World of Ice and Fire. I have a whole video on the She-Wolves of Winterfell if you'd like to check it out. On a side note, George R. Martin's naming schemes with the stories described Dunk, the Hedge Knight, the Sworn Sword, and the Mystery Knight. So the Dornish Adventure and the She-Wolves of Winterfell would absolutely not be the titles if these stories were ever written. And George has said as much. Now, in addition to having a pretty good concept on what the She-Wolves of Winterfell is about, George R. Martin has also said that he has a good idea about a story called The Village Hero, set in the Riverlands, possibly taking place between the Mystery Knight and She-Wolves. And George R. Martin did mention The Village Hero as a priority. In fact, he mentioned it just this year, though after he finishes The Winds of Winter. And on that front, we should remember that George has been talking about the She-Wolves of Winterfell for 17 years, and he's been talking about the Village Hero for 11. So keep that in mind when setting your expectations. As for other stories, well, many years ago, George did suggest that perhaps he could write up to a dozen stories about Dunk and Egg, with titles including The Sellsword, The Champion, The Kingsguard, and The Lord Commander. Fans speculate that the Village Hero would be about the Bracken-Blackwood rivalry. George has said that the She-Wolves of Winterfell is about a power struggle at Winterfell during an Ironborn invasion of the North. The Sellsword might be about Dunk being employed as a sellsword during the Third Blackfire Rebellion. The Champion might be about Lionel Baratheon's rebellion. The Kingsguard might be about the Fourth Blackfire Rebellion. And the Lord Commander would be about the tragedy at Summerhall. But honestly, there just isn't much motivation to write these stories. If Dunk and Egg gets 5 seasons and they want a 6th, maybe? But we would be talking about events in the year 2033 or beyond, when George R. R. Martin is 84 or 85 years old. Long story short, we may get the Village Hero and the She-Wolves of Winterfell, but don't hold your breath for anything else. Now, on a very interesting side note, the Hedge Knight, the Sworn Sword, and the Mystery Knight have been adapted as comic books. The Hedge Knight running 6 issues between 2003 and 2004 before being collected in a graphic novel. The Sworn Sword, originally titled The Hedge Knight 2: Sworn Sword, running 6 issues between 2007 and 2008 before being collected in a graphic novel. And The Mystery Knight, released as a graphic novel to start in 2017. And I bring these comics up because with The Hedge Knight and The Hedge Knight 2: Sworn Sword, we have 6 issues, and with A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, we have 6 episodes. Meaning, at least for this first season, we may find that the comic book follows the episodes fairly well. So let's get into the first story, The Hedge Knight, a bit. Again, Season 1 of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms will be based on The Hedge Knight, a tale whose setting is a tourney. And as I already mentioned, The Hedge Knight was written in the year 1997, during the writing of A Clash of Kings and a year after the publication of A Game of Thrones. And this is significant as when George R. R. Martin was asked to write a story for the Legends anthology, he was not yet a huge rock star writer, and was certainly not as famous as the other writers in the anthology, which included Stephen King, Robert Jordan, and Orson Scott Card. A Game of Thrones was a success, but not in the same universe as Ice and Fire is today. Let's remember that A Game of Thrones was published 29 years ago, and 15 years before Game of Thrones premiered. To put in perspective how old The Hedge Knight is, and what a different time it was, consider that the time between the writing of The Hedge Knight and the premiere of Game of Thrones is about the same as the premiere of Game of Thrones is to today. The point is, this was a very different George R. R. Martin, one that was still trying to make a name for himself. According to George, he wanted to write something that was in Westeros. Game of Thrones was his new bread and butter. But he didn't want to write anything that would spoil his upcoming novels. Not to mention, it needed to be a standalone story. Reader accessibility was almost certainly an issue as well, and George wanted to avoid a topic that the other fantasy writers in the anthology might choose. And so, for The Hedge Knight, George R. R. Martin chose a tourney. He had already included a tourney in A Game of Thrones, the Hands tourney that he had researched, and he was a huge fan of the 1952 movie Ivanhoe. Ivanhoe, by the way, is an interesting watch. You will see so much of Ice and Fire in it. Everything from the way people speak, to heraldry, to mystery knights, to Queens of Love and Beauty, to disguising oneself as a minstrel, to trials by battle. In fact, the setting of Ivanhoe is Ashby, and the setting of The Hedge Knight is Ashford. Now, being inspired by Ivanhoe, a classic tale of knights, I will say that The Hedge Knight is notably lighter in tone when compared with A Song of Ice and Fire. There's much more humor, it's nowhere near as grim, and there's but one point of view. Dunk. And the story has a happy ending, more or less, much like its sequels. Though, don't get me wrong, there's still plenty of loss and violence. This is George R. R. Martin. But it's more George R. R. Martin as a short story writer. By the way, this is George around the time he wrote The Hedge Knight. And the thing about The Hedge Knight is it's pretty self-contained, as are the other stories. And The Hedge Knight has a more precise structure to its plot. I'll get more into this in just a little bit, and I can't really go into it without spoilers, so warning here. Now, The Hedge Knight is about 32,000 words, about 6 Ice and Fire chapters, and between a 10th and a 12th the size of an Ice and Fire book. The Hedge Knight is not divided into chapters itself, but the text is broken into scenes when the location changes. There are 27 scenes in total, some being only a few paragraphs, and some spanning several pages. The comic book generally had between 3 to 5 scenes per issue. There were 6 issues, so the show, being 6 episodes, may have a very similar structure. Though I personally wouldn't have chosen the same cliffhanger points that the comic book did. I mean, it seems like a no-brainer to end episode 3 with the incident, right? The comic book for some reason started issue 4 with it. And they messed up with the trial by 7 reveal as well. That should have ended issue 4, not begun issue 5. Dunk being in a trial by combat is one thing, it being a royal rumble is another. Anyway, we will see if the show fixes these minor little gripes of mine. I'm rather optimistic as the original story is quite good and really well structured. Our story begins with a burial, Funerals are ceremonies of transition where Dunk has lost the man that he's squired for. And at story's end, we have a cremation. Funerals are ceremonies for transition. Dunk then gains a squire for himself. It's a story of rebirth and renewal. The opening scene happening at sunset, the closing at sunrise. And there's so much more to it. In a future video, I'll do a reading and a line-by-line analysis. But briefly, after the opening with a funeral, Dunk hears about a prophetic dream, later revealed to be about a dragon, and watches a puppeteer with a dragon. And just before the closing funeral, we have the trial by battle, where the prophetic dream comes true involving the dragon, and we're left wondering if there was some puppeteer to it all. It's almost as if the story is coming at you from its beginning and its ending, that is, its foregone conclusion, at the same time. You know, like two jousters heading at each other in a tilt. And if we go to the very middle of the story, we have the incident. The decisive choice that changes everything. The choice that tells us exactly who Duncan the Tall is as a person. Dunk intervening between Aryan Brightflame and Tansel Too Tall. Honestly, every time I read The Hedge Knight, I appreciate it more. It's George R. Martin at his best. You know, this guy. Even if there isn't too much to discover about Ice and Fire here. And that might frustrate some readers. Unlike with the sequels, The Sworn Sword and The Mystery Knight, there isn't too much in terms of Easter eggs and secrets in The Hedge Knight. Reading The Hedge Knight will not really enrich your perspective on A Feast for Crows or A Dance with Dragons or what's going to happen in The Winds of Winter. And this is mainly because George R. Martin wrote The Hedge Knight so early. The world is simply not yet at peak complexity. He has not yet conceived ideas like Bloodraven or Blackfire Rebellions or Valyrian death cults. He hasn't fleshed out any details about the Dance of the Dragons or the many retcons. And while in 1997 George was developing ideas on things like Faceless Men and Glass Candles and Shadow Babies, his ideas weren't firm yet, and none of them make an appearance in the story. Oh, there's a few tidbits on the death of dragons, dragon dreams, and the cycle of the seasons, but yeah, that's about it. And even for events that affect Dunk and Egg in the future, like say Jenny of Oldstones or Summerhall, there's no background on them or foreshadowing or mention of them. And this is because these ideas were conceived later, around the time of the writing of A Storm of Swords. Like I say, The Hedge Knight is a very self-contained story, but it's a very good story, and I'm quite excited to see it put to screen. And so I encourage all of you to join me next time when I go through the story line by line. We are prepping for Hedge Knight, or overanalyzing Hedge Knight. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.